The village of Eldermere sat on the edge of an ancient forest, its people bound to the land by traditions older than memory. Nestled deep within the woods lay an old, forgotten spring, a place shunned by the villagers, spoken of only in hushed tones. The elders called it the Weeping Hollow, a name derived from the eerie sounds that echoed from its depths when the wind swept through the trees. For years the spring had remained untouched, its water clear but undrinkable, its surroundings cursed by an old tale. They said that long ago a girl had vanished there, lured by something unseen beneath the water. Ever since, whispers could be heard in the dead of night, soft, pleading voices that sent shivers down the spine of those who dared to listen. No one ventured near the spring anymore. But that was about to change. 15-year-old Lena Holloway never believed in ghost stories. Raised by her grandmother, she had always dismissed the village's superstitions as nothing more than old wives' tales. She craved adventure, the thrill of proving fear wrong. When her friends challenged her to visit the spring and bring back a jar of its water, she didn't hesitate. "It's just a stupid pond," she scoffed, tightening her coat against the evening chill. Her best friend Tom hesitated. "Lena, maybe we shouldn't. My grandfather says the whispers come from the dead, warning people to stay away. And my grandmother says that eating too many apples will make your teeth fall out. Superstitions aren't real." She rolled her eyes. "Stay here if you're scared." With that, she turned and pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the unease crawling up her spine. The woods seemed darker than usual, as if the trees themselves leaned closer, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The wind whispered against her ears, but she told herself it was just the rustling of leaves. After what felt like an eternity, she found it. The spring was smaller than she had expected, a pool of inky black water, smooth as glass. No ripples, no movement. The trees around it stood unnaturally still, their twisted roots disappearing into the earth like grasping hands. Lena exhaled sharply, forcing herself to step closer. She unscrewed the lid of a glass jar and kneeled beside the water. Then, a whisper. A breathless voice, low and delicate, curling against her ear. "Help me." Lena's body tensed. She turned sharply, scanning the trees. No one was there. Her heartbeat thundered, but she shook her head. The wind. It was just the wind. She dipped the jar into the water, watching as the dark liquid filled the glass. As soon as it was full, a cold hand closed around her wrist and a scream died in Lena's throat. The hand was ice cold, dripping wet, its fingers slender and pale. It gripped her tightly, pulling her toward the water. She yanked back with all her strength, stumbling onto the dirt. The jar slipped from her grasp and shattered against the rocks. She gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Nothing. No hand. No movement in the water. The surface was as smooth and undisturbed as before. Her skin was cold where the fingers had touched her. Had she imagined it? A whisper curled through the trees again. "Lena." This time the voice carried something else. Familiarity. Her blood turned to ice. It had sounded like her mother. But that was impossible. Her mother had drowned years ago. Lena's breathing quickened. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the cursed place and never return. But she didn't. Something deep inside her needed to know the truth. She took a step closer to the water. And then, in the moonlight, she saw it. A face beneath the surface. A girl, her eyes wide and empty, lips moving soundlessly. Her hair floated around her like a halo of shadows. Lena's throat tightened in terror. The girl was staring at her. And then, the girl's lips twisted into a smile. Lena stumbled backward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Her mind screamed at her to flee, but something rooted her in place. A terrible, sinking feeling that the girl knew her. The whispers grew louder. "You found me." The voice came from all around her, as if the trees themselves were speaking. The face in the water began to change, fading in and out like mist. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. Lena turned and ran, her breath hitching, branches tearing at her clothes as she sprinted back to the village. Her chest burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop until she reached Tom. His face paled when he saw her. "Lena, what happened?" She tried to answer, but her voice caught in her throat. The memory of the girl's face burned in her mind like a brand. Someone, was in the water, she finally choked out. "She spoke to me. She knew my name." Tom's expression darkened. Lena, we have to tell someone. No one will believe us. Her hands trembled. But I need to know who she is. Tom hesitated. My grandfather, he has an old journal. Talks about the spring. Maybe it has something in it. Lena nodded, the fear in her gut clashing with something stronger, determination. If no one else would uncover the truth about the haunted spring, she would. Even if it meant facing whatever was waiting for her in the deep. Lena couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, her fingers gripping the blanket as if it could shield her from the whispering voice that still echoed in her mind. You found me. The girl in the water had spoken as if she had been waiting for Lena, as if she had always been there, watching, calling. By dawn she had made up her mind. She needed answers. Tom was already waiting when she arrived at his house. His grandfather, Elias Moore, was a frail man with weathered skin and deep-set eyes that held the weight of too many years. He sat in his old rocking chair, watching Lena closely as Tom placed a dusty leather-bound book on the table between them. This journal belonged to my great-grandfather, Elias said in a voice as brittle as dry leaves. He was one of the last to see the spring before it was abandoned. Lena swallowed hard. Did he ever talk about the girl? Elias's expression darkened. He flipped open the journal, his trembling fingers tracing the yellowed pages. The writing was faded but legible. A record of something terrible. March 12, 1876. They took her. The villagers saw what they did, but none will speak of it. The spring will not forget. The water will keep her secrets, but at a price. She calls for us in the night, and soon she will not be alone. Lena's heart pounded. Who did they take? She whispered. Elias hesitated before turning to a crumbling newspaper clipping tucked between the pages. The ink was faded, but the words sent a chill down Lena's spine. Local girl Abigail Moore, age 16, presumed drowned in Weeping Hollow. Body never recovered. Lena's breath caught. Abigail Moore. She was your family? She asked, looking at Elias. The old man nodded. My great-aunt. But my grandfather never believed she drowned. He claimed she was taken. That something or someone dragged her under the water and the village covered it up. Lena shivered. The girl in the water, had she been trying to tell her the truth? She knew my name, Lena murmured. Why would she know me? Elias's gaze grew distant. Because the spring doesn't call just anyone. It calls the ones who can hear it. Lena clenched her fists. Then I have to go back. Tom's eyes widened. Lena, no. You barely made it out last time. But she was already standing. I need to see her again. She was taken. I need to know by who. And why she's still there. Elias sighed. If you return, be careful. The dead do not always tell the truth. Lena ignored the warning. The only thing that mattered now was facing whatever was waiting for her beneath the water. The sun had just begun to set when Lena reached the spring again. The air was colder than before, the trees silent and watchful. The water was still and black, its surface unbroken, except for one thing. The whispering had begun before she even stepped closer. Lena. This time the voice didn't just whisper, it pleaded. She stepped to the edge of the water. I know who you are, she said softly. Abigail Moore. The whispering stopped. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the water rippled. Lena's breath hitched as the girl appeared beneath the surface once more. Her dark hair floating, her lips slightly parted as if gasping for air. Abigail's eyes locked onto Lena's. And then, she reached up. Lena didn't move as Abigail's pale, cold fingers broke through the surface of the water. They didn't grab her this time. They only trembled in the air, reaching, waiting. A silent request. Help me. Lena took a shaky breath. Was she supposed to pull her out? Her fingers hovered just above Abigail's. Then, a hand clamped onto Lena's ankle. She screamed. Something was pulling her down. Not Abigail. Something else. Something stronger. Lena tried to kick free, but the grip was like iron. The water rose around her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. She was being dragged in. Let go, she shrieked, her fingers clawing at the ground, dirt slipping through her grasp. A low, guttural whisper curled around her ears. She is mine. Lena's vision blurred as the water swallowed her whole. It was the first thing Lena felt as the water swallowed her whole. A bone-deep, suffocating cold that wrapped around her body like a living thing. The world above her dissolved into shadows. and she thrashed against the unseen force dragging her deeper. Her lungs burned. She couldn't breathe. Through the darkness she saw Abigail, the girl floating just beyond reach, her eyes wide and desperate. But Abigail wasn't the one pulling her down. Something else lurked in the depths. And then, Lena saw it. A shape coiled in the darkness beneath her. A figure barely visible, its face hidden in the shifting water. Long, skeletal fingers curled around her ankle. It had no eyes, but she could feel it watching her. Lena kicked frantically, twisting her body, but the thing held tight. The pressure in her chest was unbearable now. Black spots danced across her vision. "I'm going to drown." A hand grabbed hers. The girl's grip was strong, determined. For the first time, her expression wasn't one of fear. It was one of defiance. She pulled. The creature let out a low, guttural hiss, its grip faltering just enough for Lena to wrench herself free. The moment she did, Abigail shoved her upward. Lena broke through the surface with a gasping scream. The forest was gone. Violently. She was no longer in Eldermere. The spring still surrounded her, but its surface was eerily still, as though frozen in time. The trees that once stood tall around the water were nothing more than twisted blackened stumps. The sky was a sickly gray, the air thick with whispers. She wasn't in the real world anymore. A soft splash made her turn. Abigail stood waist-deep in the water, her wet hair clinging to her pale skin. But she was different now. Her eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were filled with purpose. "Where are we?" Lena's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Abigail took a step closer, water dripping from her tattered dress. "The place where they left me." Lena's pulse quickened. "Who?" Abigail's expression darkened. "The ones who made me disappear." The whispering around them grew louder, curling through the air like smoke. Lena tried to move, but the water felt thicker than before, as if it wanted to keep her here. "What is this place?" she asked. Abigail's gaze flickered toward the dark water surrounding them. "A memory," she murmured. "A graveyard for the forgotten." Lena shivered. "Why did you pull me here?" Abigail hesitated. Then slowly she raised her hand, pointing to the shoreline. Lena turned, and she saw them standing at the edge of the spring, watching. Their faces were twisted in unnatural expressions, some filled with sorrow, others with anger. Their clothes were old, tattered, their bodies half submerged in the shadows. They weren't alive. They were the others. The ones the spring had taken. Lena's breath hitched. "Abigail." The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "They don't want you to leave." Lena's heart pounded. She took a step back, the water swirling around her legs like grasping fingers. "Why me?" she asked, her voice shaking. Abigail's gaze softened. "Because you heard me." The whispers intensified, rising to a chorus of voices, some pleading, some furious. The figures at the shoreline shifted, their forms flickering like candle flames. Lena's body trembled. She didn't belong here. She had to get out. But before she could move, Abigail reached for her wrist. "You have to listen," she urged. "They took me, Lena. They took all of us. And they never paid for it." The whispering turned to wailing. The figures stepped forward, the water rippling violently around them. Lena tried to pull away. Who took you?" Abigail's lips parted, but then she froze. Her eyes darted to the water. And in that moment, Lena felt it too. The air turned ice cold, and the water convulsed as if something massive was shifting beneath it. The whispers turned into a horrible, screeching wail. Abigail's grip on Lena tightened. "It's coming." A hand, long, skeletal, dripping with black water, broke the surface. And then from the depths it spoke. "You do not belong here." The water exploded upward, and everything went dark. Lena couldn't see. Darkness swallowed everything. The world around her had shattered into a void of ice-cold water and deafening silence. She was drowning again. She tried to move, to kick, but the water felt thicker now, like ink, heavy and suffocating. A crushing weight settled on her chest, pressing her down, forcing her deeper into the abyss. Then, a sound. A deep, guttural whisper, curling through the water like smoke. "You should not have come." The voice didn't belong to Abigail. Something else was speaking to her now. Something ancient. Something angry. Lena's lungs burned. The cold was unbearable. She had to get out. But the moment she tried to swim upward, it grabbed her. A hand, long, bony, covered in rotting flesh, clamped onto her ankle. Lena screamed, bubbles escaping her lips as she kicked violently. But the grip tightened, pulling her deeper, deeper, deeper. And then, she saw its face. A figure loomed in the darkness, its body stretching like a shadow, its limbs too long, too thin. Its face, if it even had one, was nothing more than a hollow, gaping mouth, black as the abyss around it. Lena's chest convulsed. She needed to breathe, but if she did, she would die. "Let me go," she wanted to scream, but the water swallowed her words. The figure tilted its head. Then it spoke again, its voice sinking into her bones. "They lied to you." Lena's body seized. The water twisted around her like living chains and her vision blurred. Suddenly, hands grabbed her shoulders. She was being pulled up. Through the haze of suffocating darkness, Abigail's face appeared. Her lips moved in a silent scream as she yanked Lena free from the creature's grasp. For a split second, Lena felt weightless. Then she broke through the surface. She collapsed onto solid ground, gasping, choking, coughing up water. Her whole body trembled violently, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin like a second layer of ice. The spring was gone. She was somewhere else. The sky was a deep, endless gray, the air thick with a sour, decaying scent. Shadows stretched across the land like veins, crawling over broken tombstones and twisted trees. A graveyard. But not just any graveyard. A forgotten one. Abigail knelt beside her, her expression tight with urgency. "You have to wake up." Lena blinked. "What?" Abigail's fingers dug into her arm. "You're still trapped in the spring." Lena's stomach twisted. "But she looked around wildly. "I thought I escaped." Abigail shook her head. "You're inside its memory now. The memory of the ones it took." Lena's pulse pounded. "What does it want from me?" Abigail hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the rows of broken tombstones. "To understand, you have to see what happened here." She stood, motioning for Lena to follow. Lena's legs were weak, but she forced herself up, her damp hair clinging to her face. And then, he saw them. The shadows. Dozens of figures, barely visible, standing in the graveyard's mist. Their faces were pale, hollow, their eyes empty voids. But as Lena's gaze swept over them, a terrible realization hit her. They were all children. Young boys and girls, their clothes faded, their expressions locked in silent screams. Lena's throat tightened. "Abigail, who are they?" Abigail's face darkened. "The ones the village tried to erase." Lena turned to her. "Erase." Abigail's hands trembled. The spring wasn't always cursed. But a long time ago, Eldermere had a secret. She gestured toward the shadowy figures. "They took children. The sick, the unwanted, the ones they thought were cursed. And they drowned them." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The whispers. The wailing. They weren't ghosts of people who had simply drowned. They were victims. Murdered. The weight of the truth hit her like a stone. "The village." She whispered. "They did this." Abigail nodded, her voice hollow. "They called it a purification ritual. They believed that drowning the unwanted would cleanse the land. That it would keep their families safe." Lena's stomach churned. "But the spring never forgot," Abigail continued, her voice low and bitter. "It remembers every soul it has swallowed. And now it wants something in return." Lena swallowed hard. "What does it want?" Abigail's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then she spoke. "You." A sharp chill ran down Lena's spine. He took a step back. "What do you mean, me?" Abigail's gaze softened with something like sadness. "It doesn't want to let you go, Lena. You're the first to hear us. The first to see us." The wind howled through the graveyard, the shadows shifting like restless spirits. Lena's chest tightened. "But I didn't do anything." Abigail sighed. "That doesn't matter. The spring chooses. And once it chooses." She trailed off, her fingers curling into fists. Lena shook her head. "Well, there has to be a way out." Abigail hesitated. "There is," she admitted. "But it's not easy." Lena's heart pounded. "Tell me." Abigail turned, staring at the deepest part of the graveyard, where a massive, jagged tombstone loomed. "You have to break the curse." Lena followed her gaze. "How?" Abigail's voice was quiet. "You have to destroy the thing that binds us here." Lena's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Abigail's lips parted. But before she could answer, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, rumbling whisper slithered through the air, cold and sharp. You cannot leave. Lena's blood turned to ice. The shadows in the graveyard shifted. And then, one by one, they began to move toward her. The ground shuddered beneath Lena's feet. A cold wind swept through the graveyard, whispering in voices not her own. The shadows, those lost souls, the drowned children, were moving toward her. Not in anger. Not in hate. But in hunger. They were bound here. Trapped in the cursed memory of the spring. And they wanted her to join them. Lena turned to Abigail, panic clawing at her chest. Tell me what I have to do. Abigail's eyes were dark, filled with something between fear and sorrow. She pointed toward the jagged tombstone at the heart of the graveyard. There, she whispered. The curse is bound to what lies beneath it. Lena's gaze locked onto the massive, crumbling slab of stone. The air around it seemed to bend and twist, as if the world itself was rejecting its presence. The source of the curse was buried beneath it. He had to destroy it. Lena ran. Her feet pounded against the frozen ground as the whispers around her grew into a deafening wail. The shadows surged forward, reaching, clawing. Stay with us. Don't leave. Join us. Lena's breath hitched as she stumbled to her knees before the tombstone. The stone was cracked and weathered, but something dark pulsed beneath it. A heartbeat. Something was alive down there. She dug. Her fingers clawed at the dirt, nails snapping as she tore into the frozen earth. The whispers turned to screams. The children were weeping. And then, her fingers hit wood. Coffin. Lena hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stop. But she couldn't. With a deep, shaking breath, she pushed the lid open. And saw what lay inside. The drowned one. It wasn't a body. Not anymore. Inside the coffin was something twisted and wrong. A shriveled, skeletal figure lay in the rotting wood, its body blackened with decay. Its skin, stretched too tight over its bones, was bloated with water. And its eyes were still open. They locked onto Lena's. A rattling, wet breath escaped from its withered throat. You should not have found me. The thing moved. Lena screamed as its skeletal fingers shot forward, grabbing her wrist. Its grip was ice cold, stronger than iron. And suddenly, she wasn't in the graveyard anymore. Darkness. Water. Lena gasped, her lungs burning as she found herself back in the spring. But this wasn't the spring she knew. It was alive, writhing with shadows, pulsating with whispers. And before her stood the drowned one. Not decayed. Not rotting. Alive. A tall, gaunt figure, its long black hair floating weightlessly around it. Its skin was pale and stretched, its lips darkened with water. It had once been human. But now it was something else. Something born from the curse. Lena couldn't move. The water around her held her in place, an unseen force pressing against her chest. The drowned one tilted its head. You see now, it whispered, voice dripping with sorrow. You see what they did to me. Lena trembled. Who are you? The thing's lips curled into something almost human. I was the first child to be drowned. The first soul the village had sacrificed to their twisted ritual. And the one who had cursed the spring in return. The drowned one lifted a hand. The water trembled. You do not belong here, it whispered. But if you wish to leave, you must make a choice. Lena's chest tightened. What choice? The whispers grew louder. Break the curse. Or take my place. Lena's heart pounded. If she took its place, the curse would remain. The whispers would continue. More would be taken. But if she broke it, she swallowed hard. How do I break it? The drowned one's eyes flickered. And then, it held out a knife. A rusted ancient dagger. The spring must be fed, it whispered. But not with the innocent. Lena understood. The village had drowned the unwanted. The weak. The cursed. But the spring had never been meant to take them. It had always wanted the guilty. The ones who had committed the sin. Lena gripped the dagger. The whispers surged through her mind, a tidal wave of sorrow, of rage. It wasn't just about freeing the trapped souls. It was about justice. Her body trembled as she lifted the blade. And then, she drove it into the drowned one's chest. The world erupted. The water shook violently, churning like a living thing. The drowned one let out a screeching wail, its body convulsing. Darkness poured from the wound, spilling into the spring like ink. The whispers turned to screams. The souls, the drowned children, rose from the depths. They were free. Lena felt her body being lifted, the water releasing its hold. She gasped as she broke through the surface, light blinding her. And then, everything went still. The spring was quiet. The whispers were gone. Lena pulled herself onto the shore, her body shaking violently. The air was cold, but the oppressive, suffocating weight that had lingered in the forest for so long was gone. She turned back toward the water. For the first time the spring was clear. And at its center Abigail stood. She smiled softly. And then she faded into the mist. The souls had finally moved on. The curse was broken. Faint or not. Lena staggered back into town, her mind reeling from everything she had seen. Aldermere was silent. And then she saw it. A single new tombstone standing at the village's entrance. The name carved into it made her blood run cold. Lena Carter. The one who heard the whispers. Her breath hitched. And behind her, the water began to ripple.